Remember when one of Britain's most respected directors made a film so reviled on its opening week that the company distributing it pulled it from cinemas after 5 days, sold the negative to an underground dealer, and effectively erased both the film and the man who made it from British cinema? For the next 2 decades, the director cast his own 8-year-old son in the film. He cast himself as the boy's tormentor, and the critic who led the charge against it had been one of his closest professional allies for over 30 years, until she walked out of the screening and then walked out of cinema criticism entirely. Directed and produced by Michael Powell, written by Leo Marks, and starring Karl-Heinz Bohm, credited as Carl Bohm, alongside Moira Shearer, Anna Massey, and Maxine Audley, Peeping Tom told the story of a young cameraman who murders women while filming their final moments of terror. It opened in London in April 1960. Within a week it was gone. Powell, the man behind The Red Shoes and A Matter of Life and Death, one of the most acclaimed filmmakers Britain had ever produced, did not direct another major film for the rest of his career. Today we're counting down 15 weird facts about Peeping Tom. And stick around for number 1, because the writer of this film had a previous career so strange, so secret, and so directly connected to what ended up on screen that most people who've seen the film have no idea it's true. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. Does Peeping Tom deserve to be called the first slasher film? Or does that undersell what it's actually doing? Make your case below. Alright, the camera's rolling. Let's get into it. The screenwriter was Britain's top wartime codebreaker. Leo Marks did not come from the film industry. Before he ever wrote a line of dialogue for Peeping Tom, he had spent the Second World War as one of the most important cryptographers in Britain, head of the codes office for the Special Operations. Executive, the secret organization responsible for supporting resistance agents across occupied Europe. He was 22 years old when he took the role. He oversaw the codes used by agents operating behind enemy lines, including some of the most famous names in SOE history, and by his own account, he barely slept for 4 years. One of Marx's wartime innovations involved replacing pre-existing poems, the kind any well-read Gestapo officer might recognize and crack, with original verse he wrote himself, specific to each agent, far harder to anticipate. His work blended cryptography with something closer to applied psychology, understanding an agent's mental state, their habits, their fears, because that understanding was often the key to decoding a garbled transmission sent under extreme duress. Marx later said, directly, that the idea behind Peeping Tom traced back to those years, to rooms where fear was the operating atmosphere, and where understanding what frightened a person, in granular detail, was a matter of life and death. He turned that wartime expertise toward a story about a man who studies fear for an entirely different reason. The first victim was based on a real woman. Leo Marks grew up the son of Benjamin Marks, co-owner of an antiquarian bookshop on Charing Cross Road in London, the kind of shop with a specific recurring cast of regular customers, many of them eccentric, some of them living on the margins of respectable society. Marx spent his childhood and adolescence around that shop, absorbing its regulars the way any observant child absorbs the adults who pass through a family business. Decades later, when he sat down to write his first feature screenplay, he drew directly on those memories. The film's opening murder victim, a sex worker named Dora, killed within the first few minutes of the film, was based on a real woman who had been a familiar presence around his father's store. This detail rarely makes it into discussions of the film's shock value, but it reframes the opening sequence considerably. The murder that establishes the entire tone of Peeping Tom, the one that tells the audience exactly what kind of film they're watching, delivered through the killer's own camera viewfinder, wasn't an abstract genre convention borrowed from other thrillers or imported from American pulp. It was rooted in Marx's own childhood, in a real person he had actually known and likely spoken to many times, transplanted from a bookshop on Charing Cross Road into one of the most controversial scenes in British film history. The film's most shocking moment began as somebody's regular Tuesday afternoon customer. Powell cast himself as the film's monstrous father, the character of A.N. Lewis, Mark's father, a psychologist who subjected his son to a relentless series of experiments designed to study and document fear. Filming the boy's reactions throughout his childhood is played in Peeping Tom by Michael Powell himself. Not a cameo, not a brief walk-on. The film's emotional and narrative engine is built on home movie footage of this father conducting his experiments, footage that the adult Mark obsessively rewatches and eventually shows to the woman he's falling for. Powell later addressed the obvious question directly. Did playing the role amount to some kind of personal confession? His answer was that it wasn't intended as one. He needed an actor for the father, the production needed a child for the younger version of Mark, and rather than hire a trained child actor, which Powell considered the worst possible choice for the role, he used his own son. Once his own son was cast, casting himself as the father followed naturally. He described the whole arrangement as organic, something that simply happened once the pieces were in place. Whether or not it was a confession, the director of the film played the architect of its central character's trauma, on camera, for audiences to watch. Powell's real wife played the dying mother in the home movies. The casting choices inside Peeping Tom's home movie sequences go even further than Powell playing the father. The character of Mark's mother, seen in the home movie footage lying motionless in bed, dying, while her young son is filmed reacting to her condition, was played by Frankie Reedy. Reedy was Michael Powell's actual wife and the mother of the 8-year-old boy playing young Mark. So it's the home movies that adult Mark watches obsessively throughout Peeping Tom, the footage that the film presents as the source of his entire psychological condition, the documentary record of a childhood spent under surveillance and experimentation were performed by Powell's actual family, his son, his wife, himself. A fictional family's trauma, restaged using a real family's faces, shot by the real father of the real child, for a film about what happens to a person who grows up being filmed by their father. The layers here don't resolve into anything comfortable no matter how you look at them. The lizard scene scared the boy for real. One sequence within the home movie footage shows young Mark being woken by his father, who places a lizard on the sleeping boy's chest specifically to provoke and record a fear response. The elder Lewis's entire methodology in miniature, his way of demonstrating exactly the kind of study he subjected his son to throughout childhood. According to Powell's own account, when it came time to film this scene with his actual 8-year-old son, the boy's reaction wasn't acting. He became genuinely, visibly frightened. Powell described the moment afterward as one of embarrassment for everyone present on set, including, by his own description, the boy himself, who seemed unsettled by his own reaction in front of the crew. The footage of that real fear made it into the finished film. Peeping Tom presents itself, throughout its runtime, as a meditation on the ethics of filming people's most vulnerable moments, on what it means to point a camera at someone's terror and keep rolling regardless. And one of the film's most pivotal sequences is, by the director's own description, exactly that in practice. A real child's real fear captured by his real father, who then used the footage in a commercial feature film about a man irreparably damaged by precisely this kind of treatment. Critics in 1960 accused Powell of many things: depravity, cruelty, a corrupted moral sense. Very few of them seem to have grasped just how literally the film's central argument applied to its own production, or how close to home its supposed cruelty actually reached. The lead actor's accent was never explained. Karl-Heinz Bohm, credited in the film as Karl Bohm, plays Mark Lewis with a noticeable German accent throughout Peeping Tom. Despite Mark being a character who was born and raised in England, the son of an English father played by Powell without any accent at all. The film never addresses this. No line of dialogue explains why a man raised entirely in England by an English father sounds the way Bohm sounds. It simply exists, unremarked, for the full runtime. Powell's reasoning for casting Bohm had nothing to do with accent matching and everything to do with biography. Bohm's own father, Karl Bohm, was a globally famous orchestral conductor, a towering, demanding figure in his son's life. Powell believed that Bohm's personal experience of growing up under an overbearing, world-renowned father would give him a genuine point of access into Mark's relationship with his own father. The casting decision was about psychological resonance, not vocal consistency, and the unexplained accent is the visible seam where that decision shows. Audiences in 1960 had to accept an Englishman who sounded German for reasons the film never gives them, because the director was solving a different problem entirely. The critic who destroyed the film had been Powell's biggest supporter. CA. Lejeune had been the film critic for The Observer since 1928, one of the first women in Britain to hold such a position, and a critic with a career stretching back over 3 decades by the time Peeping Tom reached cinemas. Before any of that, she had built an early friendship with Alfred Hitchcock during the silent era, back when he was writing and decorating title cards for British films, and had spent decades watching British cinema mature into an industry capable of producing internationally respected work. Powell's films had been part of that maturation, and Lejeune had been, for much of that period, one of his most consistent and enthusiastic champions in print. When Peeping Tom screened for critics in 1960, Lejeune's response was not measured disappointment or a polite parting of ways. She wrote that she could not recall a film disgusting her as much as this one had, language considerably stronger than anything she'd directed at Powell's work before. She was not alone in her reaction. Other reviewers reached for words like corrupt, empty, and beastly. But Lejeune's reaction carried particular weight precisely because of her history with Powell's work. This wasn't a critic encountering an unfamiliar director's film and recoiling on first contact. This was one of his oldest allies in the British press, turning completely, in print, after decades of going the other direction. The Times' Diles Powell also condemned the film on its release, writing that its director could not escape responsibility for what she called an essentially vicious piece of work. Decades later, Diles Powell would call the same film a masterpiece, a reversal that Lejeune, as it turned out, would never get the chance to make in print herself. The critic walked out twice, then quit entirely. CA. Lejeune's reaction to Peeping Tom wasn't limited to a harsh review. She physically walked out of the screening before the film had finished. A few months later, when Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho was released, a film with arguably more graphic content than Powell's, Lejeune walked out of that screening too. Shortly afterward, after more than 30 years as one of Britain's most influential film critics, Lejeune resigned from The Observer and left film criticism entirely. The timing invites an obvious question. Was it really these two films, arriving within months of each other, that pushed one of British cinema's most established critical voices into retirement? Lejeune had reviewed films through the entire studio era, through the war, through decades of changing standards. And then, in 1960, two British and American directors she had known, and in Powell's case, championed for years, made films that, by her own account, delivered with her feet, walking toward the exit, she could not sit through. Psycho went on to become one of the most successful and influential films ever made. Peeping Tom nearly disappeared. The critic who couldn't finish either of them left the profession before either reputation was settled. The negative was sold off after 5 days. The commercial response to the critical reception was immediate and severe. According to Powell's own account, the distributors canceled the film's British distribution entirely and sold the negative as quickly as they could to an obscure dealer operating on the margins of the film trade, someone Powell described as essentially a black marketer of films. The explicit goal, in Powell's telling, was for the film to be forgotten as completely and as quickly as possible. It worked. Peeping Tom effectively vanished from British cinema for roughly 2 decades, not through any formal ban, but through a kind of total institutional abandonment. Nobody distributing it, nobody screening it, nobody discussing it. The film wasn't broadcast on British television until 1997, 37 years after its cinema release, and well after its critical rehabilitation had already begun elsewhere. A film made by one of Britain's most celebrated directors, starring recognizable actors, with a recognizable British production pedigree, was treated by its own industry as something closer to contraband than cinema. The negative itself, the physical, irreplaceable artifact of the film, passed into the hands of someone whose entire business model depended on nobody asking too many questions about where it had gone. The career-ending film wasn't the only problem. The standard account of Peeping Tom is simple and dramatic. One film destroyed one of Britain's greatest directors overnight. The reality, according to film historians who've examined Powell's career in the years immediately preceding Peeping Tom, is considerably messier. By the late 1950s, Powell was already struggling to secure funding. His films were expensive, often lavishly designed with elaborate sets and costumes, made in an era when the British film industry's appetite for that kind of spending was rapidly shrinking. His career, by some assessments, was already grinding toward a halt before Peeping Tom ever screened. What Peeping Tom provided wasn't the cause of Powell's decline so much as a clean, dramatic, narratable moment that the industry and subsequent film history could point to. One film, 1 week, one critical pile on, one career over. The actual situation was a slower, more structural problem in British film financing that Peeping Tom happened to collide with at exactly the wrong moment. Alfred Hitchcock, 5 years older than Powell, released Psycho just months later and wrote out a comparably hostile reception because he had the cushion of an extraordinarily successful preceding decade. Powell didn't have that cushion. The film didn't end his career so much as remove the only thing that might have kept it going. The viewfinder was designed to look like a rifle scope. The opening sequence of Peeping Tom places the audience directly behind Mark's camera, watching through his viewfinder as he approaches and murders Dora. The framing of that viewfinder, the specific visual design of what the audience sees, was constructed to evoke the crosshairs of a rifle scope. The connection between a camera and a weapon, between filming someone and targeting them, is established in the film's literal first images, before a single line of dialogue has been spoken. This visual choice does the structural work that the rest of the film spends 90 minutes unpacking. Mark's camera isn't a metaphorical weapon in some abstract critical sense. It's designed, framed, and presented exactly like one from the first frame. The blade concealed in the camera's tripod leg, which Mark uses to kill his victims while filming their faces, is almost redundant by the time it's revealed. The film had already told you, visually, in its opening seconds, that the camera itself was the weapon. Everything after that is elaboration. The disgust story may not be the whole story. When Powell and Boehm attended the film's London premiere, they reportedly went to the lobby afterward, expecting the kind of warm, collegial conversation that premieres of this era typically generated among industry friends and acquaintances. According to Powell's own memoir, the people they encountered walked past them with averted eyes, not confrontational, not shouting, simply unwilling to make eye contact, eager to leave, and to put the entire evening behind them as quickly as possible. Boehm, recalling the same evening decades later in a documentary about Leo Marx, described the atmosphere with a single phrase: dead silence. This detail matters because it complicates the popular image of Peeping Tom's reception as a kind of righteous uproar. Torches, pitchforks, outraged crowds. What Powell and Boehm actually describe is something quieter and, in some ways, more devastating. Not anger, but embarrassment. A room full of people who had built careers and friendships around this director, suddenly unable to look at him, walking past in silence because nobody knew what to say. The published reviews were loud. The room itself, by both men's accounts, was nearly silent. The film predicted its own rediscovery by 20 years. Peeping Tom spent roughly 2 decades in the kind of obscurity Powell's distributors had explicitly engineered. Its rehabilitation, when it came, arrived through a specific and traceable route. A new generation of American directors working in the 1970s who had somehow encountered the film despite its near-total absence from circulation and who recognized something in it that British critics in 1960 had either missed or actively refused to engage with. Martin Scorsese became one of the film's most vocal champions, eventually playing a direct role in its restoration and re-release. The film that had been sold to a black market dealer, specifically to be forgotten, became, within 20 years, a touchstone for directors who would go on to define a significant portion of American cinema in the decades that followed. Powell lived to see this happen, to watch the same film that had ended his career as a working director become recognized as one of the most important films ever made about the act of filmmaking itself. He didn't get his career back, but he got something else. He got to watch the verdict reverse while he was still alive to hear it. Powell eventually married into the film's afterlife. One of the more remarkable threads connecting Peeping Tom's rehabilitation to Powell's personal life involves Thelma Schoonmaker, Martin Scorsese's longtime film editor, whose work with Scorsese spans decades and multiple Academy Awards. Schoonmaker and Powell met as a direct consequence of Scorsese's advocacy for Peeping Tom and Powell's other work, and the two were eventually married. Powell spent his final years married to the editor of the director who had done more than anyone else to rescue Peeping Tom from the obscurity its own industry had condemned it to. It's difficult to construct a tidier emotional resolution than this, and the fact that it actually happened, that it's documented biography rather than a screenwriter's invention, gives Peeping Tom's entire story an arc that the film itself, with its bleak ending and its irredeemable protagonist, never offers. The man whose career was effectively ended by one film spent his last years connected, through marriage, to the cinematic lineage that had decided his most controversial work was actually his masterpiece. The codebreaker said the connection was literal. This is the fact that reframes everything else on this list. Leo Marx didn't simply draw loosely on his wartime experience when writing Peeping Tom. The way any writer might claim their work is informed by their background. He stated directly that the film's premise, its entire conceptual foundation, traced back to the specific atmosphere of SOE's briefing rooms during the war. Rooms where understanding fear in granular psychological detail in real time, under conditions where a mistake meant an agent's death, was the actual job. Marx spent 4 years of his early 20s studying how fear distorted a person's behavior, their judgment, their patterns, because that study was the only thing standing between a coded message and a captured agent. Peeping Tom takes that exact expertise and points it somewhere else entirely, at a man who studies fear not to save lives, but because his own father trained him to see it as something to be captured, recorded, and kept. The film has nothing to do with codes. Marx said so himself. But the mind that built it, the specific, trained, wartime-honed capacity to look at fear analytically, to understand exactly what it does to a person and exactly how to provoke it, that mind came directly from the briefing rooms of the Special Operations Executive. The most controversial British film of 1960 was written by a man whose previous job had been keeping people alive by understanding precisely what terrified them. So, there you have it. 15 weird facts about a film that cast a director as a monster, his real son as the monster's victim, his real wife as a dying mother, and then got pulled from cinemas so completely that its own negative vanished into the black market for 20 years. The critic who led the charge against it walked out of 2 films in 1 year and quit a 30-year career. The actor's unexplained accent was a deliberate choice based on his real father. And the writer who built the whole thing had spent the war studying fear itself for entirely different and far higher stakes. Powell didn't get his career back, but he got the verdict reversed, married into the lineage that reversed it, and lived long enough to see Peeping Tom called a masterpiece by some of the same people who'd once helped bury it. Like, subscribe, and share this with whoever first told you this was just an early slasher film and nothing more. They were missing almost everything. Until next time, don't forget the camera's always running.